This is a special broadcast from FSRN for Friday, November 28, 2008. Prison labor is every U.S. corporation's dream. Cheap labor, no sick leave, no time off, no holidays, and employees can be easily replaced. For human rights activists, however, it's a nightmare for the very same reasons, but on the other side of the coin, forced labor, no unions, low pay, and no protection for employees. The U.S. has used or currently uses prison labor for everything from holiday coffee for Starbucks, cutting airplane components for Boeing, Game Boys for Nintendo, equipment for the war in Iraq, shrink-wrapping mouses for Microsoft, making dentures, down to sewing lingerie for Victoria's Secret. It's a multi-billion-dollar business, and today, FSRN brings you an exclusive documentary, Prison Labor, Made in the U.S.A. I'm Aura Bogado. Stay tuned. Questions surrounding whether prison labor should be used sometimes can't be summed up with a simple yes or no answer because many questions fall somewhere in between. Take some of these into account. If we don't want China to do it, should we turn a blind eye here in the U.S.? Would it be okay to use prison labor if the workers were paid prevailing wages and had union protection? What if a prisoner wants to work? Should they be free to do that? Do prisoners actually learn skills that they can use on the outside? And if so, will companies actually hire them once they're released? What's the actual impact on the economy? Do non-prisoners lose jobs when prisoners work at a cheaper rate? And how much can Americans really stomach, knowing their products that may have at one time been made overseas are now being made in prison here in the U.S.? Reporter Karen Miller takes a look at some of the history and the current obstacles that encircle prison labor in the U.S.
As part of a growing workforce, 44-year-old Calvin is finishing up his day at a meat processing plant in Hagerstown, Maryland. He sprays down a cutting table and describes a day in the life at the plant.
We start work at 5:30 in the morning, and when we come in, my job is to find out what everything that we have to do throughout the day. I'm the floor leader. Each table has a table lead. I have to inform them if we're doing stew, if we are making center cut chops or chuck our steaks, as well as what type of patties that we're making.
Calvin fits the typical employee profile, black and male. He talks about his career track.
I've been working in this plant since 16 years. Been here 16 years. I started off as running a patty machine as a laborer, and I worked my way all the way up to the floor leader.
Sitting at a computer, Gina, a single mother of one, inputs insurance claims forms. She's been doing it for the last several years and says it's a lot better than one of her past jobs in a different department.
It was kind of boring for me, When I got there, all I did was stuff envelopes. You do paper, stuff envelopes for like PBS places, companies like that. And once I got through that job, they hired me to do a newspaper job where you have a list of keywords that certain companies are looking for. You read the newspaper. If you see that word, you cut that article out, paste it on a piece of paper, and fax it to them.
She says one of the perks of her job is that she gets paid for not only typing, but typing fast.
We also get our base pay, which is our base rate for just coming to work, depending on how long you've been here and what your position is. As to what your base rate is. So it's all your keystrokes throughout the day plus your base rate.
Gina's boss says she tries to keep the environment worker-friendly.
Most of them have been with us for many years. They earn a good salary. We don't have them scheduled breaks. They're not forced to sit there and work until they can't take it anymore. If you need to get up and go to the restroom, you need to get a cup of coffee, you need to eat your donut, you do it when you're ready to do it and then go back to work.
Gina may be able to take a break, but neither her nor Calvin get sick time, benefits, or time off. And some workers like them are usually paid less than $1 an hour, even though their labor helps state and private organizations make billions of dollars. Can I ask you how long you've been in jail overall?
I've been locked up for 27 and a half years.
And can I ask you for what?
For first-degree murder.
Calvin and Gina are not your typical employees. They're both part of the estimated 90,000 prisoners that work in the U.S. prison labor system.
Yeah, I live in a cell. It's, It's A building is where I live, and it's right up, right up the sidewalk right here. It's just a great big building. You walk in, it's a lobby with the officer station, what we call the bubble, the officer's bubble. And then there's a door on the left and a door on the right. And one is the right side is the west side, the left side is the east side. And I live on the west side, wherever you're going, they open up the slider to let you in, and you go in.
The 13th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution may have freed the slaves, but it didn't free prisoners. The article reads, "Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude exist within the United States, except for a punishment for crime." Prison labor, the 13th Amendment, slavery, and the racial makeup of jails today all have a common link. Before the Civil War, laws governing slaves were called slave codes. After the Civil War, the slave codes were rewritten as black codes, which outlawed legal activity for many African Americans. Ryan King is policy analyst for the Sentencing Project.
A lot of the offenses that seem to be highly criminalized for African Americans in the middle and late 19th century tended to be crimes that now we would sort of scoff at, like vagrancy and loitering and sort of being out and about, being out in the streets in areas after dark.
King says the potential power shift of having the slaves freed and the need to maintain the old racial order contributed to the need of having them locked up.
There's no question that Southern politicians and many Southern residents had a great deal of fear of social destabilization in the wake of emancipation from slavery, and so criminalizing a lot of the types of conduct that were seen to be more commonly committed by African Americans, and certainly targeting the enforcement of those offenses among African Americans, very much was indeed an effort by the state to reassert control over a population that there was a great deal of fear.
But there was another factor: economics. Prior to the Civil War, most penitentiaries were white. But as more African Americans were being thrown in jail, the racial makeup changed and more of those convicts were put to work. Penitentiaries used convict labor for government protection and contracted the work out to private businesses to operate within the prisons. Prisoners were also leased out to private bidders to be housed, fed, and worked as slaves. This system of convict leasing lasted for decades and provided one of the harshest labor systems America had ever seen. Convict labor was used to rebuild the South, but Heather Thompson, professor of history at the University of North Carolina, says it benefited those around the country as well.
So even though it was, we think about the convict leasing system as Southern, it does have Northern roots. One of the reasons that the South uses convict labor is that Northern businesses invested in rebuilding the South. And from their point of view, it made a whole lot more sense to use convicts for labor than bringing in, say, immigrants, which is what, the Northern situation was full of immigrants. And they knew that immigrants could try to agitate for higher wages and try to agitate for unions. And so from the Northern businessman's perspective, convict leasing was a good idea. So it's a very complicated history. Very tied to the end of slavery, but by no means unique to the South.
Convict leasing was largely eradicated by the 1930s for a couple of reasons. First, there was a growing outcry against the inhumane treatment of the convicts, and second, unions began to fight against the system because it depressed wages. But there was another reason as well. Again, Heather Thompson.
Because of the Depression, the economy was in such trouble that there was a lot of motivation among government officials to restrict convict leasing. So it's important to realize that there was a time when we really didn't have as much prison labor.
For decades, laws restricted the use of prison labor and selling prison goods across state lines. All that changed, however, with the Justice System Improvement Act of 1979. In this act, Congress enacted legislation to change the laws on the sale and shipments of prisoner-made goods, products, and services. Soon, Unicorn was born. Heather Thompson.
So we have, for example, at the federal level, a tremendous amount of products being made that are sold. In fact, the federal prison industry now is known as Unicor. It's sort of the brand name. And Unicor, their trade name was where the government shops first, because it was providing so many things. For example, it made furniture. It made new stainless steel products, thermoplastics, modular furniture, Kevlar reinforced products. It made products for the military. It had a whole textile line that it overhauled in the 80s. So this was a very profitable enterprise at the federal level.
But an enterprise